Good day. Today is Saturday, 19th April 2025, and it is, of course, the day before Easter Day. This year, celebrated tomorrow both by the Eastern Orthodox churches and by the Western churches. And, of course, tomorrow is a special day for me and my family. I am an Orthodox Christian. All my family are Christians. And I would like to wish everybody on the eve of this important holiday a very happy Easter. I say that regardless of your faith, or absence of faith, your religious orientation or lack of whatever, or lack of it. For me, as I said, it is an important day, and I wish everybody who's watching these programs a good and happy day on that important holiday. Now, obviously, and for my part, I intend to be spending Easter Day with my family. I think it is extremely unlikely that I will be making a program tomorrow. Only some really earth-shaking major event will make me do so. So no video from me tomorrow, but I will be publishing another video. I will be back to publishing videos as normal on Monday. Well, with that, let us now proceed to the events of the last couple of days. Obviously, I didn't make a video yesterday, which was Good Friday. But as it happens, yesterday was an extremely busy day in the diplomacy. And by the way, also in the war. And there's been some important and very interesting developments in the war, which I will touch on at the end of this program, but I'm going to focus mostly on the diplomacy and on that extraordinary meeting in Paris. Now, in my last video, I said that the EU leaders and the British were meeting again in Paris. I've lost count. I generally have lost count of the number of meetings that the Europeans have held to discuss the Ukrainian conflict over the last couple of weeks, basically since Donald Trump's inauguration, and more specifically since the argument in the Oval Office between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky, which took place at the end of February. I mean, the number of meetings has been off the scale. And I ought to say that, so far as I can see, the output of these meetings, the actual new ideas, the actual concrete proposals that have come out of these meetings has been microscopic and out of all proportion with the amount of energy and time that all of these various European leaders have dedicated to having these meetings. I can remember the late economist J.K. Galbraith once talking about the no business meeting, by which he meant meetings at which no business was actually conducted, and about the important role that these play in politics and diplomacy and and indeed human society generally. And I'm tempted to say that most of these meetings, convened by Starmer and Macron and all of the others, have mostly been no business meetings. But I think the same cannot be said about the meeting that took place in Paris on Friday. And the reason is because of the American participation, and that was on a much bigger scale than I had anticipated when I touched on the meeting, the fact that the meeting would take place in my program, which of course I made on Thursday. Specifically, when I made that video on Thursday, I assumed that the Americans would be represented by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. I thought it interesting that Rubio would be leading the delegation, not Witkoff. And I assumed that the Americans would play a secondary role in the meeting. In fact, and instead, the Americans sent a very powerful delegation indeed, headed by Rubio, but Witkoff was present and was a member of the delegation as well, as indeed was Witkoff. They were all there. The two factions that have been arguing about what to do with the conflict in Ukraine and have been battling for Donald Trump's ear were both represented in this at this meeting. And the Americans not only sent a very powerful delegation, but they have dominated the discussion and they have dominated the meeting and indeed the coverage of the meeting. And of course, the words that have attracted the most attention and which have appeared across the media right around the world over the last 24, 36 hours were the initial words of Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, when he said that American patience is now wearing thin, that unless there is a breakthrough in the negotiations over the next couple of days, the United States will walk away. It will cease to make efforts to bring the negotiations to a conclusion, to achieve a satisfactory, peaceful outcome to the conflict. Though Rubio did not make clear what exactly would happen next, whether there would be a cessation of American military aid to Ukraine, whether there would be further sanctions against Russia, or something of that kind. But anyway, Rubio gave a very strong impression that it was a make or break matter. And he specifically spoke about Donald Trump as the individual who is basically making this push. Trump, apparently, according to Rubio, has many other matters that concern him. He's got many other priorities. That is, of course, a gigantic understatement. To repeat again, an obvious point, one that many appear to have overlooked over the last couple of days. President Trump is currently carrying out both an internal revolution within the structures of the American government within the United States and is attempting to carry out an economic revolution on top of that with his tariff policies. And as I and the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I have discussed in several programs, he is now engaged in what looks like an all-out geopolitical conflict with China, economically a country with a bigger industrial manufacturing technology base than the United States' own. And of course, that doesn't also cover the situation in the Middle East, the conflict or potential conflict with Iran. Absolutely, it is the case that President Trump has an awful lot on his in tray on any one day. And when Rubio mentions Trump as having more priorities and having to take time to devote himself to those priorities and being distracted by the seemingly fruitless process to achieve peace in Ukraine, well, Rubio's actually telling the truth. So it does look to me as if it is clearly Trump who has told his negotiators, Rubio, Kellogg, presumably Waltz also, and Witkoff, that this matter has to be tied up soon. He can't afford to give it more time. And Rubio was sent to Paris with that message and was told to convey that message to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians who were also present. And importantly, the Ukrainians at this meeting were not just represented by their foreign minister, but by Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, the man who met with the Americans, with Rubio himself, at that meeting in Jeddah a number of weeks ago, the meeting at which the Ukrainians appeared to agree to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Now, I'm going to anticipate and I'm going to say what I think myself has happened. And that is that I think that Donald Trump was told before the election by Keith Kellogg specifically that settling this conflict would be a relatively straightforward thing, that the war between Ukraine and Russia was in effect in a stalemate situation, that both sides were suffering immense losses, and that the Russians, as well as the Ukrainians, would quickly agree to a peace, provided the Americans made certain concessions, which Kellogg probably sees as big concessions to the Russians, but concessions which do not fundamentally alter the whole picture. So I say that because Bloomberg has told us what Bloomberg believes to be the American proposal that Rubio, Kellogg, and Witkoff took with them to Paris. It is for a ceasefire, a freezing of the conflict on the existing contact line, an agreement that Ukraine will not enter NATO. That apparently has now been taken fully off the agenda, at least as far as this president and this administration is concerned. It is not clear what further legal safeguards are being offered to the Russians in order to ensure that that topic, the topic of Ukraine's NATO membership, never comes up again. But anyway, that's the proposal at the moment. And we've had some further details from the New York Post. These speak of the United States formally recognizing Crimea as part of Russia. Apparently, the other territory that the Russians control in the remaining 4 regions will not be recognized by the United States formally as a part of Russia, just saying. And there's no expectation in Washington that the Europeans will recognize it either, just also saying. And that Russia will be provided with a certain amount of sanctions relief, though again, it's not clear what the extent of that will be. And it's quite clear that there is no intention for the moment to lift sanctions on Russia entirely. Now, this has been presented by Bloomberg and by the New York Post as a new American plan. The new American plan that was taken by the United States, by Rubio, Kellogg, and Witkoff with them to Paris. It is no such thing. It is exactly the same. It is identical in all respects to Kellogg's plan. It is, in fact, Kellogg's plan. It is the plan that Kellogg essentially outlined in his article of April 2024. It's clear that Kellogg is unable to move beyond it or to think beyond it. He has senior officials within the administration who support him, Rubio, Mike Waltz, and others. And for the moment at least, having persuaded the president, Donald Trump, to adopt this plan last year, the administration, Donald Trump, has still been working forward with it. Now, what I think has happened is that Donald Trump has become increasingly exasperated with the fact that getting the two sides, both the Ukrainians and the Russians, to accept the Kellogg plan is turning out to be far more difficult than Trump had anticipated. I think there's growing tensions over this issue, this precise issue between Trump and some of his negotiators. And I think Trump basically has told Rubio, Kellogg, and Walz that this is the last chance. They go to Paris, they speak to the Russians thereafter, they see whether they can ram through the Kellogg plan by the end of this month, by the 30th of April. Trump had been led to believe earlier that a ceasefire would be in place and an agreement would be signed by Easter. That clearly isn't going to happen. So this time the discussion is about getting it all agreed and signed and tied together by April, or Trump will simply walk away. He will drop the plan. He will take no more time or energy, invest no more time or energy trying to have the plan brought into effect. He has been repeatedly told by Witkoff, as other US officials have been, but it is Witkoff, obviously, who has spoken to Putin, that the Kellogg plan is unworkable, that it does not answer to Russia's strategic concerns, but he's prepared to give Rubio, Kellogg, and perhaps Walz one last chance, one last throw to get it done. That is my own guess as to what we're seeing happen at the moment. And of course, Kellogg, Rubio, with Witkoff in tow, have come to Paris in order to try to get everybody, the Europeans and the Ukrainians, fully signed up to the Kellogg plan, so that the Kellogg plan can then be proposed to the Russians apparently next week. And if the Russians then reject it, or if the Ukrainians refuse to go along with it, then so be it. Donald Trump says that he will walk away. Now, what are the prospects of this happening? Firstly, I think the Europeans do not like the Kellogg plan because they have become absolutists about the war. They want the war to continue. They do not want the Russians to be left in control of any territory in eastern Ukraine. Having said that, the Europeans some months ago came to accept that Kellogg's plan was the best chance they had of getting some kind of outcome in Ukraine that would work to their advantage. It's clear that the European leaders, Macron and Starmer, have been working very closely with Kellogg, and it is clear that the plan to send European peacekeepers into Ukraine, peacekeepers, war fighting forces, a tripwire force, call it what you will, reassurance force is what you prefer, that has been coordinated by the Europeans with Witkoff, with Kellogg. Kellogg confirmed as much in a recent post on X, and in fact references to European peacekeepers are there in his original article of April 2024. So this is where the whole idea of sending British and French troops and other European troops into Ukraine has come from. It has been coordinated and perhaps even proposed by Kellogg as he's tried to put his plan into place. So the Europeans, I think, don't like Kellogg's plan. It falls short of the outright victory over Russia that they had been seeking. They do not like the idea of relaxing sanctions on Russia, and they themselves are perhaps unlikely to do so. But they will go along with it because it's the best that they can achieve at this particular point in time. So that's one side. The Ukrainians is much more difficult because ever since the meeting in Jeddah, Zelensky and the Ukrainians have been rowing back on many of the proposals, many of the things that they appear to concede in Jeddah. Now, prior to the meeting in Jeddah with the Americans, Andriy Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, wrote an incredibly belligerent article in The Guardian, the British newspaper The Guardian, in which basically he took the hardest possible line against the Russians and basically continued to insist that all territories in Ukraine must be returned to Ukraine. Well, things have fluctuated since, but it looks as if the underlying Ukrainian position remains that the Americans got Yermak and some other Ukrainian negotiators isolated in Jeddah. I've described the circumstances. Zelensky himself was kept away, just as he's been kept away from this meeting in Paris, by the way. But the Americans worked on the Ukrainians. They got them to accept a 30-day ceasefire. And as I pointed out at the time, the agreement, the statement that was published after the American-Ukrainian talks in Jeddah made no reference to any of the talking points that the Ukrainians have harped on about. It didn't refer to Ukraine's territorial integrity, to Russian aggression. It said none of those things. It seemed as if the Ukrainians had moved from the extremely hard line Zelensky has been taking and from the hard line that Yermak outlined in his article in The Guardian. Well, as always happens, as soon as the Jeddah meeting was out of the way, Zelensky and Ukrainian officials, including Yermak, went back on whatever things they may have said to the Americans in Jeddah. Zelensky now says that Ukrainian territory remains Ukrainian. That includes Crimea. Ukraine insists on all of this territory being returned to Ukraine. It may not happen immediately. He concedes that. There might be military challenges about achieving that. He appears to accept that that is the reality. But eventually, at some point, all Ukrainian territory must return to Ukraine. He also insists that Ukraine retains its sovereign right to apply to and join both NATO and the European Union. He is not prepared to compromise on this. The Americans might say that Ukraine should not join NATO, but Zelensky insists that they should. And of course, so does Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer has openly said that Ukraine is on an irreversible path towards NATO. In fact, he signed a treaty with Zelensky that commits Britain to exactly that objective. So Zelensky is not prepared to compromise on that issue. He is, of course, not prepared to compromise on any of Ukraine's internal arrangements. He's not prepared to take any step, for example, to restore the status of the Russian language, something he sort of campaigned on doing when he stood for the presidency of Ukraine and won election to be president, by the way, just saying, but he's not prepared to concede on that. He's not prepared to concede on the Russian Orthodox Church, the status of the Russian Orthodox Church. And, of course, he's not prepared to make any concessions whatsoever on limits on the size of the Ukrainian military. This formed part of the discussions in Istanbul back in March and April 2022. Contrary to widespread belief, it appears that the Ukrainians did make substantive concessions to the Russians on this issue. They did accept that there would be significant reductions in the size of their military in Istanbul, but Zelensky has now gone back entirely on all of that. He insists that Ukraine be allowed to have as big and as powerful a military as it wants. He insists that it should be armed to the hilt, that Ukraine should have the right to arm its military to whatever size and whatever scope it wishes. That remains for him a red line. By the way, if you go back to the April 2024 article that Kellogg wrote, in that article, Kellogg also speaks about the United States rearming Ukraine, continuing to arm Ukraine after the end of the war. So on this issue, Kellogg and Zelensky are in effect in agreement with each other. The point is that none of this is acceptable to the Russians, and they have made that repeatedly clear, and I don't believe that their position is in any way going to change. They're not going to shift from their stance, and we got a clear sign that they're not going to shift from this stance in the latest contacts that the Russians and the Americans have had with each other. Now, when Rubio arrived in Paris, and after he had his meetings and discussions with the various European officials, and presumably with the Ukrainians as well, he telephoned Lavrov, which was, it must be said, a courteous thing to do. And supposedly, he briefed Lavrov on the discussions that the Americans had had with the Europeans and the Ukrainians, and no doubt informed him in general outline about the fact that the Americans are still working within the framework of Kellogg's plan. Well, it looks as if Lavrov made it completely clear that Kellogg's plan continues to be unacceptable to the Russians. Now, I say that because we have had a readout from the Russian Foreign Ministry of the telephone conversation between Lavrov and Rubio. And it reads as follows. On April 17th, 2025, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had a telephone conversation with the United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Secretary Rubio, who is currently in Paris, informed the Russian side about the recent engagements that he and US Presidential Special Envoy Steve Witkoff had in the French capital. Notice that the Russians don't refer to Kellogg. Kellogg was apparently with the others in Paris. The Russians have long since made clear their fundamental view that Kellogg is far too pro-Ukrainian for their tastes and cannot act as any kind of peace envoy and mediator. And notice that the Russians ignore him completely in this readout. Anyway, the readout then continues. These discussions involved representatives from Ukraine, France, and several other European nations. In fact, as I understand it, primarily Britain and Germany. It was underscored that these contacts were in alignment with the framework of ongoing consultations between Moscow and Washington, including the recent dialogue between President Putin and Steve Witkoff in St. Petersburg. And then comes the key sentence. Sergei Lavrov reaffirmed Moscow's readiness to continue collaborative efforts with American counterparts in comprehensively address the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. And then the readout finishes. The Foreign Minister and Secretary of State concurred in the necessity to maintain prompt communications channels, particularly in light of forthcoming meetings scheduled by American and European officials with Ukrainian representatives next week. Now, the key word here again is Sergei Lavrov reaffirmed readiness to continue collaborative efforts with American counterparts to comprehensively address the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. When the Russians talk about the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis, well, they have made absolutely clear in interview after interview, in statement after statement, in speech after speech, what that means. And there's no doubt either that it has been clarified and communicated to Witkoff in many places. They want, as they've put it, a just and permanent end to the conflict. Of course, their conception of what a just end to the conflict differs fundamentally from that of the Europeans, and I suspect from Kellogg himself. And obviously it's completely different from what the Ukrainians expect. But it requires the entirety of the four regions to be transferred to Russia. It requires all of the various other things that have been talked about many times. The protection of rights of Russians on Ukrainian territory. Lavrov discussed this at great length in his recent interview with Kommersant. It discussed restrictions on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. It relates to changes within the Ukrainian political system so as to eliminate the ideology that has taken such a stronghold over Ukraine over the last 15 to 20 years. It also requires cast iron guarantees that Ukraine will never enter NATO. And if we go back to the original April 2022 agreement, it also requires Ukraine to agree that there will not be any military deployments of any kind on its territory by foreign forces without Moscow's prior agreement. I don't expect the Russians to compromise on any of these issues. So, Lavrov, it looks to me as if he reiterated all of this, probably in very polite language to Rubio. The Russians do want to maintain some kind of a dialogue with the Americans, but they're not prepared, as far as I can see, to make any fundamental compromises at all. Now, we come back here to the Europeans, to the Ukrainians. Will the Ukrainians, for their part, agree to the various parts of Kellogg's plan that the Americans are apparently insisting on? Again, it looks as if Zelensky is preparing to balk at Kellogg's plan. He is not prepared, it seems, to agree to any loss of territory. He still insists that all of Ukrainian territory must be returned to Ukraine. And he is not prepared to agree to recognition by the United States of Crimea as a part of Russia. So, one way or the other, it seems unlikely that the Ukrainians will agree to this proposal, but then the Ukrainians are in a very difficult position, and perhaps they could be persuaded to agree, especially if the Europeans, who have grudgingly accepted Kellogg's plan, pile up behind them. But it seems to me all but inconceivable that the Russians will do so. And that, if we follow the logic of what Rubio has been saying, presumably means that at the end of April, the United States will cease its various attempts to continue to mediate, to try to mediate the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Now, we have had some comments about this from Trump himself. Trump was asked specifically whether he agreed that the United States would continue to provide weapons to Ukraine if there was a complete breakdown in the negotiations. Trump appeared to me to categorically rule that out. He seemed to me to make it very clear that he did not intend to continue to supply weapons to Ukraine. There's been some claims, some indications over the last few days that Ukraine very unwillingly is gradually moving towards acceptance of the American imposed mineral rights extraction agreement. They've apparently now agreed the memorandum of intention that Zelensky and his team had been expected to sign during Zelensky's disastrous visit to the Oval Office back in February. However, the Ukrainians do say that the mineral rights extraction agreement still needs to be negotiated, that the details of it still need to be negotiated, and that there is still a lot of, as they put it, hard work to do. Well, we might get the Ukrainians to agree to the mineral rights extraction agreement, but the United States has now said that this is irrelevant to the question of the negotiations. It is about the United States recovering the cost of its earlier support for Ukraine. It is not about the United States continuing future support for Ukraine. So the Americans have basically said that Ukraine signing the mineral rights extraction agreement, which it's important to say comes without security guarantees, does not mean that the United States will continue to commit itself to Ukraine. So that might, by the way, make the Ukrainians wonder what the point of signing this document and ultimately ratifying it even is. But let's put all that aside. So the Americans, it does look as if the negotiations fail, at the moment, their stance is that the United States will not continue to provide weapons to Ukraine. Perhaps an even more interesting comment was a brief comment made by Trump himself during a question and answer in the Oval Office. He was asked about what would happen if the negotiations failed, and he said this: if for some reason one of the two parties makes it very difficult, we're just going to say you're fools and horrible people, and we're going to take a pass. Now, we're going to always rely on everything that Donald Trump says, but it seems to me that he's essentially giving the Russians now a veto over this whole process. If the Russians say no, which, as I said, I am sure they will over the course of the next few weeks, then the United States will walk away, and further military assistance by the United States, at least weapons deliveries by the United States to Ukraine, will end. Now, this comment of Trump's, in which he says, you're horrible people, you're fools, which could be, as I said, addressed at the Russians. It doesn't make any explicit threats. Trump, right at the beginning of his presidency, did threaten the Russians with severe sanctions or tariffs if they didn't comply with his demand for an end to the war. In other words, if they didn't accept the Kellogg plan. Witkoff, however, has had 3 meetings with Putin. He's probably come back and told Trump what is, I'm sure, the case, which is that Putin has told Witkoff that Russia will not bend, will not compromise, and that if the United States wants to go down the road of further sanctions and further tariffs and all of that, well, then so be it. So it could be that Trump has now come to the understanding that further sanctions against Russia, if the Russians reject the proposal, are pointless. Certain recent comments that he has made strongly suggest that, and it could be that if we do get sanctions after a Russian rejection, further sanctions, they will not go especially far. It presumably anyway has not escaped Trump's notice that the country which, from a Russian point of view, is by far the most important in trade terms, which is China, is already heavily tariffed by the United States, by Trump himself, and that any further pressure on China to observe whatever sanctions the United States proposes to impose on Russia, it is almost guaranteed to be brushed off by Beijing as adding nothing more to what the United States has already done. I mean, if tariffs, for example, are already increased from the already impossible 145% to 245%, as some people are suggesting, well, what fundamental difference does that make, given that most of the trade between China and the United States has, in effect, come to a total stop? So the Chinese can just go on buying Russian oil and Russian gas, and it will make no difference. Now, on this topic, I should say that certain comments by the Chinese ambassador to Russia about the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline suggest to me that a final agreement about this pipeline is now almost ready for conclusion. He seemed to think that all of the problems had basically now been mostly ironed out. Xi Jinping, of course, is likely to be in Moscow on the 9th of May. In fact, he is going to be in Moscow on the 9th of May. He's due to visit Moscow on that date to attend the Victory Day celebrations on that day. I think it is a possibility, a strong possibility, that the two presidents, Putin and Xi, might sign the agreement on the Power of Siberia pipeline, Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, when they meet each other in Moscow for those celebrations. Just saying. It would be a strong show of support by each for the other. The Russians committing to supply China with gas and oil to make up for any problems that the United States, that China has obtaining oil and gas from the United States. Well, that has basically stopped. China no longer imports oil from the United States, and it has just confirmed that it is no longer importing LNG from the United States either. So it makes sense now for the Chinese to complete a deal with the world's major gas exporter, which is a producer and exporter, which is of course Russia. And oilprice.com has written recently a most interesting article which says that though the Russians expect their oil exports to remain flat henceforth until they start to decline from sometime in the 2040s, 2050s, the Russians are planning a major surge in natural gas exports by 2050. Russia plans to double its natural gas exports by 2030 and triple them by 2050. The strategy focuses on expanding exports to friendly countries and developing Arctic resources. And 2030, doubling gas exports by 2030. The only way I think that could be done quickly in the sort of 5 years that are left would be by completing Power of Siberia 2. Obviously, Russia can also export LNG to various countries around the world, but that also suggests to me that final agreement on Power of Siberia 2 is just round the corner. So I assume that Trump knows at least some of this, and that the sanctions threat, the further sanctions threat against Russia is not going to have any effect. So that's presumably why he makes these rather vivid comments. He basically says that you're fools and horrible people, but he's not threatening anything more. Now, that's my own guess of where we perhaps are. It looks to me as if Trump's real anger probably is more against Kellogg and others. He feels that he was led down the garden path. He supposed that this would be an easier negotiation than it had turned out to be. He's found Zelensky intractable and impossible, and he's found that the Russians actually mean what they say. And as I said, it does seem to me as if he's going to give Kellogg and Rubio one last chance, and then he's going to walk away. The only question is, if that is what does indeed happen, given that it does look as if weapons deliveries to Ukraine will cease, what Trump ultimately intends to do about longer-term relations with Russia. Does he follow Witkoff's advice, which is put the whole issue of Ukraine to one side and move forward in forging a better and friendlier relationship with Russia over the long term? Or does he wait for a while and give it about a year and then perhaps resume contacts with the Russians then? Or does he instead follow the advice of the hardliners and perhaps impose some further sanctions against the Russians, perhaps supports actions to confiscate the Russian assets, Russian central bank's frozen assets, that sort of thing, and leave it at that? Well, perhaps the best course would be to give it a year or so and then come back to this issue. it seems to me that the risk of going down the route of further sanctions and confiscations of assets and doing that kind of thing is that it will not only solidify still further the Chinese-Russian strategic partnership, but it might in fact turn the Russians against the idea of a rapprochement with the United States entirely. I'm not sure whether Donald Trump wants that, but as I said, the decision ultimately will be up to him. Anyway, we will see. In the meantime, it does look to me as if we're now closer than at any point that we have been until now to the point where the United States finally does decide to walk away. I think this is what Trump ought to have done. I've discussed this many times. We've talked about it on the Duran. I think this is what Trump ought to have done right from the outset. He should never have got involved in Ukrainian negotiations. He chose to go with Kellogg. I think he's now understood that that is a path to nowhere. He's wasted several weeks on 2 telephone calls with Putin, a number of meetings, but at last he's apparently finally deciding to move on. Now, one person is quite unequivocal about welcoming all of this, and that is Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president and the former Russian prime minister, and who is now the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council and the head of Russia's Military Industrial Commission. And Medvedev has just posted this comment on X. He said, American officials have said that if there is no progress on the Ukraine case, the United States will wash its hands of it. Wisely. And the United States and the EU should do the same. Then Russia will figure it out faster. That's Medvedev's view. He says, that's what you want to do. Walk away. Well, that's wisdom. That's good sense. Just walk away and we'll take care of it from now on. The Europeans should do the same. Of course, they won't. But the United States will be acting sensibly and rationally, and it can just leave us, and we can sort out Ukraine by ourselves. Now, Medvedev has said more things than just that. He's also spoken about the plan, the continued European plan to deploy troops to Ukraine as part of some kind of peacekeeping force. His comments on this have been absolutely ferocious. And basically what he said about that was that if the Europeans do that, then the Europeans will just come back in coffins. He said that if European soldiers are deployed to Ukraine, what the Europeans are doing is that they're simply guaranteeing a greater production of coffins in Europe. I'm not going to repeat Medvedev's exact words. They were spoken in the usual brutal way that he sometimes likes to use. It was a pretty brutal comment. And again, I have to say, that comment of Medvedev's and this latest comment of his on X both suggest to me that the Russians are in an uncompromising position. So anyway, there we are. That is, it seems to me, what the situation now is, that the Americans are going to make one big, last, final push to get everybody to sign up to the Kellogg plan. They are going to succeed with the Europeans because the Europeans don't like the Kellogg plan because it doesn't deliver outright victory, but they will accept it because they have no choice. The Ukrainians may balk and may push back. Zelensky seems most unwilling to make any kind of concessions at all. But perhaps, as they did in Jeddah, under the weight of American and perhaps European pressure, they too will grudgingly come round to the Kellogg plan, though perhaps not in their entirety, and still insisting on their rights to join NATO at some future time and to keep their army as big as possible and to equip it to the greatest degree possible. But I expect that the Russians will reject the Kellogg plan. They probably are no longer intimidated by sanctions. They probably no longer expect that sanctions will be imposed on them, further sanctions will be imposed on them, or if they are, they will be of a token quality, judging from Trump's latest words, and they will then do what Medvedev says. They will press on and they will continue the war until victory. Now, on this last point, they have someone who agrees with them on the American side, and that is the very well-connected American journalist, David Ignatius. Now, David Ignatius is widely assumed to have US intelligence agency connections. He is a strong supporter of Ukraine. He says that the United States does indeed intend to step away from the conflict in Ukraine. And he also expects that American military supplies to Ukraine are going to end. Lastly, he says that the Europeans are not in a position to replace the Americans as Ukraine's major military supplier. And the result is that over the course of the summer, Ukraine is going to start to suffer ever heavier losses. And I think that is absolutely the right prediction of events. Already, as we will shortly see, the Ukrainians are struggling to hold back even the earliest, most preliminary moves that the Russians are taking before the start of the major Russian offensive, which I believe will be in May. But, the Russians have already started the preparatory steps to their offensive, and they're already beginning to win significant ground. And this is despite the fact that the Ukrainians are still receiving at least some arms and equipment from the United States. But without constant deliveries, especially of artillery and other equipment from the United States, I don't believe that the Ukrainians are going to be able to hold out for very long. And in terms of their air defense, the problems can only grow. The Ukrainians are desperately short already of air defense missiles, as they admit themselves. Trump has refused to supply Ukraine with more Patriot air defense missiles. And that means that the situation in the sky, in the air, is going to become increasingly lopsided and is going to tilt steadily in Russia's favor. So that is my own view about where all of this is going. Now, of course, the Ukrainians and the Europeans, especially the Ukrainians, are putting a positive front on all of this. And the Ukrainians in particular are saying that because of the enormous advances that they've achieved in drone warfare, that is enough by itself to hold back the Russians. And they've apparently been telling this to the Americans, and they've been telling this to the Europeans, and they say this all the time to each other, and perhaps they believe it. One of the other things that Marco Rubio said when he came to Paris was that there is no possible military outcome to this war, that neither side in effect can win, and that is the reality that people have to face. Well, when I heard that comment of Rubio's, I did initially wonder whether it was in fact being addressed to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans. After all, Zelensky still is committed to achieving some kind of victory over Russia, and incredibly, so are some Europeans also. Ursula von der Leyen recently wrote about how the West, Europe, needed to do everything within its power to put Ukraine in a strong negotiating position, and in order to do that, it had to work towards achieving some kind of Ukrainian military victory. It did seem to me that what Rubio was very politely trying to do was to point out to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans that that is completely delusional. There cannot be any military victory over the Russians in Ukraine. That was attempted with the 2023 summer offensive, and it failed totally. And I would say that we now have a great deal more information about the early period of the war, and it is quite clear that the American military leadership, and no doubt the British military leadership, and the Ukrainians also, assumed and believed in the autumn of 2022 that the Kherson offensive that Ukraine launched at that time would also inflict a military defeat on the Russians, which would probably force the Russians to sue for peace. It's clear that the Kherson offensive, the autumn 2022 Kherson offensive, was much more ambitious in conception than was initially assumed. It was not merely intended to recapture Kherson city. It was intended to destroy Russian forces west of the Dnieper River and then cross the Dnieper River and advance towards Crimea itself. And that it was expected and assumed that that would force the Russians to sue for peace. I remember that shortly after, in the autumn of 2022, the then director of the CIA, William Burns, and the head of the Russian intelligence agency, the SVR, Sergei Narishkin, briefly met in Ankara. This is in autumn 2022. And there was a meeting between them. And I now think that more likely than not, Burns was still hoping that the fact that the Russians withdrew from Kherson, even if the objectives of the full offensive were not achieved, would be enough to get the Russians to agree to some kind of settlement of the conflict on American terms. And anyway, Burns came away from that meeting, as we now know, deeply disappointed. Anyway, my point is that if the Americans and the Ukrainians and the Europeans were not able to win the war in the autumn of 2022 and in the summer of 2023 against Russian forces which were much weaker then than they are today, there is not any possible chance, not a ghost of a chance, that they can win a military victory against the Russians today. Just saying. And I think that was at least part of the message with those words that Rubio was trying to convey to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians. But I also now suspect that Rubio, along with Kellogg and other US officials, has perhaps also accepted some of this rhetoric coming from Kiev that this enormous increase in drone production that the Ukrainians have supposedly achieved or have achieved is sufficient in itself to hold the Russians back. Now, I'm going to here make a number of brief observations about this. Firstly, I've come to the view, quite independently of this issue of drones, that, to say it briefly, Ukrainian reporting standards about progress in the war have slipped markedly over the last couple of weeks and perhaps months. The Ukrainians, for example, repeatedly spread stories that they'd recaptured places like Kotlino and Pyshanye and Shevchenko close to Pakrovsk. I don't believe that they ever recaptured these places. The Ukrainians also mounted a whole series of counterattacks around Toretsk. They tried to pretend that the Battle of Toretsk was in some way still ongoing. It seemed to me at the time very much of a PR exercise, and I believe that still. And in fact, I think the evidence now points in that direction conclusively. And I think what's starting to happen is that as the war goes increasingly badly for them, the Ukrainians are starting to believe a lot of their own propaganda. I think this happens quite a lot, by the way. It happens in many wars, and I think it's especially happening in this one. First of all, there is overwhelming evidence that the Russians now have many more drones over the Ukrainian skies than the Ukrainians do, and contrary to what many reports claim, I believe that the Russians use their drones more effectively, much more effectively than the Ukrainians do, because they've had time to train drone operators, and they have far more of them than the Ukrainians have, and their drone operators are able to conduct drone operations without much risk, whereas Ukrainian drone operators, who can be identified quite quickly, by the way, by tracing back the signal that they used to guide the drones. Ukrainian drone operators are very vulnerable now to Russian artillery and missile strikes, and there have been many reports of them being killed. That's the first thing to say. But I'm increasingly coming round to the view that one of the effects of this over-focus on drones is that it is drawing attention away from the yawning artillery discrepancy. The Russians, as Syrskyi himself has told us, were firing 40,000 rounds a day at one point last summer. Their firing rate is now 28,000 rounds a day, again, according to Syrskyi. Spread out over a whole year, that means that the Russians are firing between 10 and 14 million shells in the conflict in Ukraine, spread out over the whole year. This is far more than had appeared to be the case previously. Just saying. So, it looks to me as if the artillery imbalance has dramatically shifted to the Russian side. It is artillery that kills and destroys most effectively on the battlefields. This has been consistently true in all wars. I think it is and continues to be true in this war. And I think this constant talking about drones is partly intended to conceal that. And I think to some extent it has concealed it. Now, we've just had another exchange of bodies of dead people, between dead soldiers, between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And the Russians returned about 20 times more dead Ukrainians than the Ukrainians returned dead Russians. Now, I have up to now resisted drawing inferences from this about the actual casualty totals. And I still think that this is not the most reliable indicator. But the pattern over the last couple of months has been that this gap of dead Ukrainians returned by the Russians and dead Russians returned by the Ukrainians, this gap between the two is now growing, and it is growing to really extraordinary dimensions. Partly, I am sure, it is because the Russians gain more ground and therefore are more likely to pick up bodies of dead Ukrainians than the Ukrainians are likely to pick up bodies of dead Russians. And I'm sure that plays an important factor here. But I wonder whether there has indeed been a big increase in Ukrainian casualties and a fall in Russian, and whether this isn't perhaps explained by the enormous difference in artillery use between the two sides. And it's not just artillery use, because contrary to that article that appeared in Forbes by David Axe, and the article that upon which it was based by Fighter Bomber, the Russian blogger, it looks as if Russian fabs are indeed being used continuously across the battlefronts and continue to be effective. And there are reports that the fabs have in fact been modified and improved, and that their accuracy, if anything, has grown. And with air defenses in Ukraine now thin, that probably is not surprising. Also, that the Russians are able to drop more bombs in more places. They're able to launch far more drones, far more of the big drones, the Duran 2 drones, than the Ukrainians can. Every night now we get reports of Russian drone strikes right across the entire territory of Ukraine. Last night, as it happens, was a big day of Russian drone and missiles, a big night of Russian drone and missile strikes across Ukraine. Dnipro, the city of Dnipro, on the Dnieper River, was a particular target, but this is now taking place every night all across Ukraine. And it looks as if hundreds of drones, Uranium-2 drones, are now being used. And it looks as if now a very, very significant proportion, more than half of them, perhaps, on any particular night, are getting through. And this is probably because air defenses in Ukraine are becoming depleted. There's been an interesting article about this whole topic, about Russian drone production. It talks about the enormous expansion of the factory that makes these drones in Kazan. It says that a secondary factory producing these drones has also now been opened in another city on the Volga called Izhevsk. Apparently, a new type of drone, similar in some respects to the Uranium-2, is now also being produced by the Russians in quantities. The Russians are able to launch these drones on a far bigger scale than the Ukrainians can launch drones against Russia. And for the record, the quantity, the number of Ukrainian drone attacks on Russia appears to be falling, or has fallen over the last couple of weeks from the peak that was achieved a few months ago. Now, on this topic, by the way, and just to say something, Ukrainians and Ukrainian commentators speak about Ukrainian drone production taking place inside Ukraine itself. There's been an interesting article, a good piece, on his blog by Simplicius the Thinker, in which he talks about pictures that have appeared of what appears to be a factory producing drones for Ukraine, which is supposed to be located thousands of kilometers behind the front lines. Simplicius the Thinker, I think probably correctly, puts all the figures, all the information together and speculates that this factory, which probably accounts for the bulk of Ukrainian drone production, isn't located inside Ukraine at all, is probably instead located in Germany or Poland or someplace like that. And I think that could quite possibly be true. So when I've talked before about an artisanal industry for drone production in Ukraine, bear in mind that the realities might be different. But just to say, in spite of all of that, it's clear that the Russians are getting the advantage in drone warfare, and they're getting an ever bigger advantage in every other sector altogether. And it is starting to reflect the realities on the front lines. Now, I'm not going to discuss in detail the various pieces of news that we've had from the battlefronts over the last couple of days, but there have been two very striking events. The first, which I think is less important actually, is that apparently a Russian raiding party broke into the village of Malaya Tokmachka, located close to Rabotino on the Zaporozhye sector. This village, Malaya Tokmachka, was used for a time, as I remember, as a staging post during Ukraine's 2023 offensive. It's a small village. It's located close to Rabotino, not so far from the front lines. It's on the way to Orekhov itself. There's scanty news about the fighting there. It's a striking fact that this place has now been attacked, but I don't think it tells us very much, ultimately, about the state of the fighting in Zaporozhye region, though the Russian media, perhaps because this place is so famous from the 2023 fighting, is all over the place with it. They're talking about this constantly. But there's been a lot of other news from other parts of the front lines, and all of it cumulatively points in the same direction. The Russians, as I said, I think in my previous video, have recaptured the monastery near Gornal in Kursk. Apparently, they've now captured most of the village of Gornal itself. It looks like that battle is ending, and it looks as if the Russians are planning to cross into Sumy region from that part of Kursk region as well. Just saying. But the other big news, the main big news, apart from the fact that the Russians continue to increase pressure west of the Oskol River, north of Kupiansk, there's even some reports that advanced parties of the Russians, perhaps reconnaissance groups, have actually entered at various times Kupiansk itself from the northwest. Who knows? Possible. And though there continue to be many reports of the Russians continuing to gain ground in the area of Liman, in the southern parts of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers. The most dramatic news continues to come from the area of Konstantinovka Toretsk, Chasov Yar, and the area around Pakrovsk. And it does now increasingly look as if the major weight of the pending Russian offensive is going to come there. Yesterday, reports started to circulate that the village of Suche Balka, which is located to the west of Toretsk, has now fallen under Russian control. This is a small village, but it was apparently a highly fortified village. It was the linchpin of Ukrainian defensives in this area. As I said, to the west of Toretsk. And its capture apparently opens the way for a Russian advance into Konstantinovka itself. Konstantinovka is located just to the south of this place. But anyway, this place has now also fallen. Perhaps even more dramatic, or at least my guess is it's more dramatic, is that the Russians now appear to be launching a major push towards encircling Pakrovsk on the east. They've already established themselves strongly to the west of Pakrovsk. As I said, they definitely control places like Kotlino and the others. But it looks as if they are now working to try to advance towards Pakrovsk from the east as well. And there are reports that the Russians are now starting to push towards the village of Novoekonomichnye and Mirnye, which are located on the road from Pakrovsk to Konstantinovka, but literally on the eastern part of the road. Now, there was a report yesterday that the Russians had advanced into a village called Mirolyubivka. This is located just south of the road, not far from Novoekonomichnye and Mirnye. And of course, the Russians have also been pushing to advance in the area to the east of Pakrovsk in other locations. If the Russians do capture these places, if they actually capture, for example, Novoekonomichnye, given that the Russians are already positioned very strongly to the southwest of Pakrovsk, then it does seem to me as if the communications to Pakrovsk are really going to be cut by not just by drones, but by artillery and all this. And I would have thought that this is all preparatory to an operation to storm and capture Pakrovsk, which we could start perhaps to see take shape over the course of May. Anyway, all of this is happening, and it's happening right across the front lines. And I suspect that when Rubio talks about the situation on the battlefronts being in stalemate, maybe he also is putting too much faith in these Ukrainian claims about drones. Because, frankly, the realities of what is going on the battlefronts simply don't bear this out. Not only are the Russians continuing to advance and capture territory, but they're doing so in ways that are more and more threatening to the remaining Ukrainian positions in Donbass. One of our old friends has one of our old friends, I think it was Marochko, has actually now come out and said that the Russians control 80% of Donetsk region, that there's still a few cities left to capture, but these being Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Pokrovsk, and one other, but that gradually the Russians are coming closer to the point that they will indeed be able to capture them. So, if these cities start to fall over the next few months, one after the other, which I think is quite likely, then of course this whole narrative, again, of the war being unwinnable is going to start to collapse, at which point one wonders what people in the United States, in Europe, and indeed in Ukraine itself are going to say. Anyway, perhaps that's moving too far ahead. Maybe we should focus on the events of the next couple of weeks. It's looking quite likely that April will be the last month that the United States is fully committed to support Ukraine. Trump looks like he's become fed up with the failures of the Kellogg plan. He's given Kellogg and Rubio and Witkoff one last chance to make it work, but he's not prepared to go beyond April. Rubio has said this to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians. The Russians have heard that, and in the case of Medvedev, one could almost say that he's rubbing his hands with glee at the prospect. And it could be that one of the reasons why Trump feels able to do this is because he's been persuaded that the war is indeed in stalemate and that he doesn't need to do anything further because he can just walk away and the conflict will just continue without any dramatic outcome. But if he thinks that, then I think he's wrong. And if the Europeans and the Ukrainians have persuaded themselves of that too, then I think that they too are wrong. And I think that in the summer and autumn, they're going to be shocked and surprised when it turns out otherwise. But anyway, we shall see. As I said, I am confident that the Russians will indeed reject the Kellogg plan. They've shown every sign that they intend to do so. I don't think they feel under any pressure to accept it. I think they feel that the war is moving in their favour. I think they also feel that the international situation has consolidated and solidified in their favour also. I've seen a list of the heads of state and leaders who intend to attend the Victory Day parade in Moscow on the 9th of May. Both Xi Jinping and Modi will be there, as well as Lula. Vučić of Serbia has apparently brushed off European threats and said that he is indeed going. So has Fico of Slovakia. So I think that the Russians feel that their political position, their international position is solid. The war is going as they would wish. They are very far from exhausted or run down. All claims to that effect are straightforwardly wrong. Drones have been an important factor in the war, but they're not the magic weapon that I think some people imagine. And I think the Americans probably will pull out at some point in the next few weeks. And then the outcome will be, as Medvedev says. He says that Russia will figure it out faster, and I think he's right. And, well, he says that the UK, Germany, and France have come together for talks on how many European coffins they will be ready to accept after the deployment of their troops in Ukraine. So you see that the Russians are feel themselves to be in a very strong position, and that they are indeed sensing that things are going their way. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. I would just quickly add that Putin has had apparently extensive meetings with the Iranian Foreign Minister, Mr. Arakchi, who has been in Moscow. Arakchi has also met Lavrov, and so there's movement on the Iranian negotiations as well, and probably on relations between Russia and Iran too. So, as I said, a lot of pieces are in play, but I will come to that in my next program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget also to if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Let me wish you all again a very happy Easter and a very happy holiday, and peace and goodwill to all of you. And I'll be back on Monday. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.